Over the past century, significant changes have occurred in the area of women's Torah education. But a vibrant and ongoing debate persists about this subject. By exploring the treatment of this matter in the Talmudic sources and throughout Jewish history, we aim to gain a deeper understanding of the current landscape, the factors that have shaped it, and the pathways that lie ahead. In this week's parsha, in Parshas Nasai, we learn about the soita, the adulterous woman, and the whole procedure that is done in the Beis HaMikdash in a case of Isha soita. And according to what the Torah says, if the woman was guilty of adultery, then she was essentially supposed to die very soon after the Mei soita was, after she consumed the Mei soita. However, the Mishnah throws in an important caveat. The Mishnah says that if the woman has a schus, then it can delay this inevitable outcome. What type of schus? So the Gemara clarifies it's the schus related to Torah, because Torah is the most powerful schus. So what schus and Torah does the woman have? The schus and Torah that the woman has, the Gemara explains, is that she helps her children learn Torah, she helps her husband learn Torah, and that alone could make it delay a year. Another opinion says it could be 2 years. Another opinion says it could be 3 years. These are the delays that could happen in order to delaying the punishment for the Isha Soita. As a result of this, in the Mishnah in Soita and Perek Gimel, Ben Azai, one of the Tanoim, says the following statement. Mikan Oimer Ben Azai. Ben Azai says, based on what we just said, Chayav Adam Lalamed is Bitoy Torah. A person is obligated to teach his daughter Torah. Why is this? So he explains as follows. What's going to happen? Imagine a woman doesn't learn Torah and doesn't know this detail, this din, this caveat that a schos can delay the punishment. So she's going to drink the Mei Soita. Nothing's going to happen. And she's going to immediately say, oh, the whole thing's a farce. She's going to go home. She's going to tell all her friends the whole thing is a farce. And that's going to be a terrible thing. We don't want that to happen. So therefore, we need them to know. So because we need the women to know, so therefore here we see that there's an assumption of knowledge. There's an assumption that women would know that there is this idea of the schus being of the schus Torah. And so therefore we say, Chayav Adam Lomay Desbitay Torah, obligated to teach a woman Torah. Now whether he meant that this is the Raisa, he probably meant that it's a rabbinic obligation. He probably agreed with the underlying principle that's stated elsewhere, that Minat Torah, women are pater from Limud Torah, and he's probably saying that it's a rabbinic chiyuv. The question that we need to ask ourselves is, if this is what you're trying to protect against, you could do something very simple. What do? You make a kinus, and you invite all the women, and you say, by the way, I have one piece of crucial information that everyone needs to know. That there's this din of Saita, but if a woman has a schos, it could delay the end result, and then you accomplish the goal. Why is it that we're deriving from this small detail, the Chayav Adam Lalamed is Bitay Torah, and now I know that I need to teach my daughter all of Torah? What's going on over here? So I think there are two possible approaches to understand the Shita of Ben Azai. One approach is to say the following. If you were to come and you were going to say that, the listener, the woman listening says, I know what it says in the Torah. And I'm familiar that it says in the text of the Torah that if you are guilty, you're going to die. So now you're telling me this information? Where are you getting that from? So you need to say, it's a drasha on the psukim. Where's the drasha on the psukim? Because the pasuk is worded in a specific way, and from there we derive this din. You could imagine people saying, people are unfamiliar with how halacha works. That sounds like baloney to me. I don't believe that doesn't sound right to me. When could a person be convinced that this drasha that Chazal made on this, whichever words they use, and I don't want to go into the drasha right now, but whichever words they use for this drasha, when is it convincing? It's convincing if all of your life, or much of your life, you're exposed to drashas Chazal, and you know what a kal v'chomer is, and you know what a gzeira shav is, and you know what an extra word is, and you know what a miyut is, and you know what a ribi is, and you see it applied in so many areas, and you see that the halacha you're observing is relying on that. So then when you show me that based on that same system, we have this idea that schos toila, that the delay, about the delay factor, then I'm going to buy it. But just giving it as a piece of standalone information, it's not going to be impressive. So that's one solution to this problem. there's another possible solution to this problem, and that is that Ben Azai wasn't really basing his opinion off of this specific din. Ben Azai has a standalone opinion that comes from somewhere else that women need to learn Torah. And he's just pointing and saying that, by the way, here is a small indication to my larger view. Where might there be a hint for this idea? Because one of the famous things about Ben Azai is that when it came to marriage, he declined. And the Gemara in Yevamis, Daf Samach Gimel, says that he said, Uma esa, what should I do? Shenafshi chashka b'Torah, I strongly desire Torah. Efshar la'olam sheyiskayim al yedei acherim. The world can go on procreation with other people being involved. And so therefore, I don't need to do this. Now, what do you see from here? What you see from here is even what some would say is the most important mitzvah, the mitzvah of Pru'Revu, the first mitzvah in the Torah. Even that mitzvah, we have a reality and where Ben Azai is saying, thanks but no thanks, I don't want to get involved. In other words, what's bigger, Talmud or Maaseh? The famous discussion of the Gemara, what's greater, Talmud or Maaseh? And it seems that Ben Azai would hold very clearly that Talmud is the greatest thing. Or to put it in other words, and Reb Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, in his Sefer on the Rambam, on the relevant passage in the Rambam, interprets it this way. How does a Jew derive spiritual life? According to Ben Azai, it's only Torah. There are other ways, in other opinions, there are other ways you can get through mitzvahs for other areas. But for Ben Azai, it's clearly only Torah. And that's why he says, I don't care about I'm disregarding even the mitzvah of Pru'Revu because Torah is the most important thing. If that's what you believe, then as a result, you're going to believe that you need to educate women and that you need to educate daughters, Torah, because that is the only path, essentially, to connect to Hashem. And it could be that's the underlying shita that Ben Azai has. Then it comes to Maseches Sotah, and he says, oh, by the way, here is an indication where we're assuming knowledge. So not that it's not one of the Lashon, because the Lashon of the mission is Mikan Omer Ben Azai. The Ben Azai is deriving it from here, but Reb Tzadok says that it looks like that you read Mikan, here is another indication for the idea that women are learning Torah, even if this is not the base. So that's two approaches for dealing with the problem that I raised a moment ago. But the bottom line is, we have a Shitta Ben Azai. In summary, what did we do right now? We saw that Ben Azai held, there's a chiyuv to teach women Torah. Ad kan, the Shitta of Ben Azai. However, he's not the final word on this question. And in that very same Mishnah, Maseches Sotah, Rabbi Eliezer, another Tana, disagrees. And in fact, not only he disagrees, but he uses very sharp language. And Rabbi Eliezer says, Kol hamalamed bitay Torah, anyone who teaches his daughter Torah, ki'ilu melamda tiflus. It's as though he's teaching her, the fancy word for this is licentiousness, which essentially means non-sneistic behavior, sexual immorality. Now, whoa, that sounds like a non sequitur. How do you get to teaching your daughter Torah leads to sexual immorality? How does that even happen? So Rashi al-Asar explains basically as follows: that what the concern here is that when a person is very simple, so they aren't intelligent enough to, so to speak, skirt the law. But when a person becomes sophisticated, they could also become shrewd. When a person becomes smart, they could also become devious. And that's the idea of using knowledge and sophistication and cunningness to do negative behavior. So the idea is that basically there's a certain mistrust, it seems, that women want to, at least at times, engage in negative behavior. But they're going to be caught and they don't know how to do it effectively. If you're going to teach them Torah, what's going to happen is they're going to have armumis, shamitoicha himevina armumis. She's going to gain cunningness from the process of learning, because you develop the mind and you become sophisticated and smart and street smart and all those things. And then oiset vareh bahatzne, and then she's going to do it in a way where it's going to be concealed. And now she thinks she could get away with it, and she's going to go on with this behavior. When you read this Rashi together with Rabbi Eliezer, it stings. I think it stings on a few levels. First of all, we live in an era where the whole idea of concealing knowledge, of not sharing knowledge, is out of style. Today, als is often all information, right? Even the concept of government secrets, some people believe there shouldn't be such a thing. Remember, there was once a time that for most Jews, there was an entire area of Torah, Kabbalah, that was known that this is something you can't learn. And it was like accepted. So there was like this understanding that there may be an area of Torah that that I don't have access to. Today, open access. So just on that level, when you learn this, you're like, what? That's number one. Number two, Torah is so central to our identity as Yidden and our identity as Jews, that the idea that you keep it away from half of Klal Yisrael is also like, again, that's like a little bit of a shocking thing. And the third thing is, there's like a certain underlying assumption here, as the Gemara often says, like, are we talking about wicked people? And there's a certain mistrust of women here, where it seems like they're going in a negative way, and if we give them knowledge, then it's just going to be weaponized in a negative way. And I think for many of us who read this, we're like, I don't know if I fully understand what that is. But okay, this is what Rashi says, this is Rabbi Eliezer says. Now possibly, because of some of the things that I just said, the Rambam actually offers a different interpretation of what Rabbi Eliezer meant. Because Rashi is based on the idea that tiflos has something to do with tzniistic behavior. However, the Rambam learns that tiflos actually is maloshin, shav and hevel. False, emptiness, vanity, and what is the idea basically is, you're teaching them Torah, you're teaching them nothingness. Now what would the meaning of that be? So the meaning, and we'll soon see, he clarifies in Mishnah Torah, is because they're not capable to understand. If they're not capable to understand, so you're teaching them, you're wasting your time, you're wasting your time, you're wasting her time, you're wasting everyone's time, and we know time is precious and important, so if you're teaching it, it's like you're teaching lies, you're teaching emptiness, you're teaching vanity. Okay, so now you could think in your mind, this doesn't have some of the sting that Rashi's interpretation have. On the other hand, this is stating that women don't have the ability to comprehend areas of Torah. So that itself is also something we look today as a modern reader, and we're like, I don't know if I fully understand that, or at least not fully to the degree that the Rambam would be saying that. Okay, but this is the machloikes of the Tanoim that we have. Ben Azai says, teach women Torah. Rabbi Eliezer says, mitarnished. Presumably it's a machloikes derabanan. In other words, he's saying midarabanan, you're obligated. He's saying midarabanan, it's a bad idea. And now the question becomes, so what is the final halacha? So there is a posek, not so well known, but in Italy, in his day, he was very well known. He lived in the 1200s. In Italy, his name was Reb Shaya Achron, meaning he's Rabbi Shaya II. He had a Zayda named Reb Shaya. When we learned Gemara on the side, sometimes you saw Toisus Rid. Toisus Rid is his grandfather, Yeshaya Ditrani. The Enikol is Rabbi Shaya, and he's called Rabbi Shaya Achron, the later Rabbi Shaya. He lived in the 1200s, and he wrote a Psak Halacha digest on the Gemara. And look what he writes. He writes, although a woman is not obligated to learn Torah, if she wants, she totally has the permission, which is Imrata lalamda, excuse me. If you want to teach her, you have the permission to teach her. So that is against the words of Rabbi Eliezer, siding with Ben Azai. Then he goes on to say, and he adds, in fact, during the times of the Beis HaMikdash, when they used to have the story of the Saita, then it's not a permission for a father to teach, it would have been obligatory for the reason that Ben Azai had said before. In other words, Rabbi Shaya is passing like Ben Azai. And he's just saying that it's only an obligation, Bisman Habayis, because remember, Ben Azai's point of concern, at least in one way of reading it before, was that the Soita process should work out properly, and for that he wanted Limud Torah. When you don't have the Beis HaMikdash, so then it's okay, it's a Reshus, but clearly it's not Rabbi Eliezer. Now, if this would have been the psak all poskim would have taken, so then maybe things would have looked one way. The reality is that most poskim didn't go in this direction. And let's look at the Rambam in Hilchos Talmud Torah.
The Gemara doesn't paskin?
So generally speaking, the Gemara doesn't paskin. The Gemara gives shittas. What happens is, one of the major jobs of poskim is to try to tell from the tone and the style of the Gemara who it's paskining like. So for example, if there's a certain view that gets more attention, if there's a machlokes between Ben Azai and Rabbi Eliezer, and the shitta of Rabbi Eliezer gets more attention, there's more questions on it, and it's just garnering more discussion, then that's one of the clues for poskim that the halacha is going to be like Rabbi Eliezer. And in fact, that's how when the Rambam is going to pass like Rabbi Eliezer, some of the commentaries ask why. It's not like we have this rule, the halacha is always like Rabbi Eliezer. In fact, there's sources that indicate that, he was a little more from the school of Shammai, and Lav Dafka the halacha is always like him. But in the Talmud Bavli, I didn't bring it in the class, there's a little more discussion on his shitta than on Ben Azai's shitta, and that's one of the reasons that the Mefarshim say that the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Eliezer. Let's see the words that he uses. Says the Rambam in Hilchos Talmud Torah Perek Aleph. Tzivu chachamim shelo yalamed adam es bitay Torah. Do not teach a daughter Torah. Mipnei, why? Sheroiv hanoshim. So not everyone, but he says the majority of women, and by the way, he does not say nairos and ketanos, he says noshim. Mipnei sheroiv hanoshim ein daiton mechuvenes le'islami. They're not prepared to be taught. V'hei moitzi in divrei Torah, l'divrei havai, l'divrei lefi aniyas daiton. And they are going to apply the Torah in a empty way, in accordance with the fact that they don't have the ability to understand it properly. And then he quotes the teaching from Rabbi Eliezer, Kol HaMalamed es bita Torah ki'ilo limda tiflus, which, remember, in Persian Mishnayos he told us, tiflus means nothingness. Okay, so here we have the Rambam paskening like Rabbi Eliezer. By the way, there's no exceptions for any area of Jewish law that's mentioned over here. He just says this is something that should not be done for the reason of paskening like Rabbi Eliezer. The Torah paskens like the Rambam. The Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, paskens like the Rambam. We'll come to Ramah later on. In fact, the Torah actually has an interesting vart in Parshas Kiseitze, when it says that there's an isser for a woman to wear man's clothes, lo yisiya kli gever al isha. So he points out that gever al isha is gematria 611. What's gematria 611? Torah is gematria 611. Lo yisiya kli gever al isha is lo yisiya kli Torah al isha. A woman shouldn't be adorned with Torah. Okay, so that's the Baal HaTurim following what he does in his Halacha Sefer, doing it also in the Baal HaTurim in his short commentary that he has on the Torah. Now, although this is the Halacha, the reality is that from day one, from the times of the Tanoim, all the way down through every single era in Jewish history, there have been women who were very knowledgeable in different areas in Torah. In fact, there are a few collections where people try to document all of them. We're not going to go through all of them. We're going to point to one or two of the more interesting ones. Obviously, it's going to raise a question. How do you have that together with halacha being like Rabbi Eliezer? So the two examples that we're going to look at is, first of all, is the famous case of Bruria, who is mentioned in the Gemara. But rather than turning to a text of the Gemara, I'd rather look at one of the medieval sources who quotes it. This is Reb Shimshon Mekinoy. Reb Shimshon Mekinoy lived in Ashkenaz. He lived during the 13th century, and he wrote a sefer called Sefer HaKrisus. And this book, Sefer HaKrisus, is actually Klalei Talmud. He goes through the Yud Gimel Midas explaining them. He goes through the Lamed Beis Midas explaining them. He explains like the Klalei Talmud, how halacha works and how the Gemara generally works. And along the way, by the way, he's famous because there's a line that Tzemach Tzedek brings in a mimer from the tshuva of another Rav who quotes him, Reb Shimshon Mekinoy. You all heard that line. The line is, Ani mispalel l'da tinok. That when I daven with the mindset of a child. And he was trying to mean, no Kabbalah, I don't need spheres and stuff, I just focus on God. That's brought in Chassidus very often. Who is the one who said that line? It's Reb Shimshon Mekinoy, quoted in the Tshuva by the Rivash. But anyway, here in his Sefer HaKrisus, look what he writes. Matzinu isha niskeres bebraisa chaylekes in hatanoim kidain or kidin tana. We find a woman mentioned in the Braisa who is arguing with the Tanoim, just like a Tana. Where, and he gives them Alamakam, Maseches Kelim. There's a discussion over there in Perek Aleph of Baba Metzia. Maseches Kelim has 30 chapters. So just like Nezikin had 30 chapters and it was divided into Baba Kam, Baba Metzia, Baba Basra, so too Maseches Kelim was divided into 3, and this is Perek Aleph of the second section, Baba Metzia of Kelim. That there's a machlokes over there. And then Bruria said what she thinks. And when Bruria's words were repeated, Yeshua said, Yafa Amra Bruria. She said the right thing. In other words, the other rabbis where the halacha was not like them, and the halacha dafka was like Bruria. Bruria is the wife of Rameir, the daughter of Chanina ben Tradion. So says Reb Shimshon and Mekinoy, look at this line. Yatsasi miderech hakavana. I went off my track, what I was in the middle of talking about, only to point out the novelty. To show you that there's a woman who's involved in the discussion of the Tanoim. So this is one example. There's another very interesting example that comes from the travelogue of one of the Rishonim, Reb Psachia of Regensburg. Reb Psachia of Regensburg, sometime in the year, around the year 1175, he leaves Ashkenaz and he travels around the world, and he writes about his experiences and his travels. There's a lot of interesting things that we're able to learn from this account. He writes about what he saw in Baghdad. And in Baghdad there was a rabbi by the name of Shmuel ben Eli. Shmuel ben Eli is a bar plukta of the Rambam, meaning he felt that the Rambam, he's the one who led the campaign that the Rambam didn't do enough to promote the belief in Tchias HaMesim and Mishnah Torah, and so he had a strong voice about that, which generated a controversy and responses and attacks and counterattacks. So this is Reb Shmuel ben Eli. So Reb Sachia writes in his travelogue that Reb Shmuel has, first of all, he has Yichis all the way to Shmuel Haramasi. Fine. Then it says he doesn't have any sons. He only has one daughter. Doesn't even give her name. V'hi bekiya bekriya v'talmud. She's baki in kriya is Tanakh and Talmud is Talmud Gemara. V'melamedes hakriya lebachurim derech haloyin echad. She's teaching the bacharim through a window. V'hi skura bebinyan. She's inside the building. Hatalmidim machutz lamata. They're outside the window, lower down. Ve'enam royam. They don't see it. Remember, you're dealing here in 12th century Baghdad. The tznius in general society was very, very strict there. I think he writes in his account, men on the street don't see women. They just don't encounter women. So it's not surprising to see a strong element of tznius here. But what's fascinating is that despite that, the daughter, Reb Shmuel's daughter, is teaching the Bachrim. Now, when I first read this, I'm like, this doesn't really sound like a very good educational model for you to have a teacher who's in a building, and you're outside the building, and that they're inside and you're outside, and you can't even see her. How is this? But I read the full chapter. I think I got a little more of a context here. When he describes how students learn from their male teachers, the Rosh Yeshivas, it's a very, I don't know what the right word is, but it's a very distancing type of a relationship. So he describes that there's a Rosh Yeshiva sitting here, and the Rosh Yeshiva has two Meturgamans, one on his right and one on his left. The Rosh Yeshiva never speaks to the students. The Rosh Yeshiva speaks to the Meturgaman and says, tell them they're doing Gittin. Tell them on the right this and this and this and this. Then the Meturgaman starts talking and explains and elaborates. Then he turns to the Meturgaman on his left. He says, they're doing Kiddushin over here. You tell them this and this and this and this. The Meturgaman elaborates and explains, and he just sits there. And then the students, when they have questions, they have to ask the Meturgaman. If the Meturgaman doesn't know the answer, then he'll pass it on to the Rosh Yeshiva. So when I saw that, I realized there's a whole different context here of the relationship between the teacher and the student. So all of a sudden, it doesn't sound so crazy for the woman teacher to be inside the building and for the students not having, so to speak, direct access to her. But the main point that we derive from here is this is the second example of the idea of women being very knowledgeable. Now, if you paskin like Rabbi Eliezer, the question is, how do you have this result? It's not just two, there are hundreds. There are hundreds of these. And there are many more that we don't know of. Now, of course, I don't want to suggest that this was the norm. These were obviously exceptions, but even an exception, how did this happen? So there are two basic answers that are given to this question without having to rock the boat too much. One is given by Rabbi Yeshua Falk Katz, who's the author of the Sefer Miras Hanayim on the Shulchan Aruch. He's also the author of the Sefer the Prisha, and it's from the Prisha. He's writing in the 1500s, and he writes as follows: the lashon of the Rambam was roiv nashim. Most women can't do it, he says. Ava, and that's diuk number one. Diuk number two, the whole framing, both the Rabbi Eliezer and the Rambam, is not to teach, not to teach, not to teach. Never said anything about not learning. Aval im limda la'atzma, if a woman learned on her own, if she's an autodidact, then anurayin, then we see sheyatza me'arayv. Then obviously she's not like the masses, she's not like the regular. And then obviously you're not going to have any of the problems. And she's not going to misunderstand the Torah into nothingness. And so all of a sudden we have here a model that says, yes, but there's an exception. People shouldn't teach women Torah because of the majority. Women have the ability to extract themselves from the majority. How do they do that? By demonstrating a willingness and a desire to learn. And once they've done that, no problem, Shalom Yisrael. So this is one solution. The Chidah gives another solution, which is a small variation. Lav dafki, you need to wait for the girl to move on her own and to show that she's doing this on her own. If you, as an educator or a parent, are able to tell that this girl is different from the regular and she is very talented, so then go ahead and teach her. And he says that's what happened with Bruria. Because so these are the two explanations that we have, either because of self-learning or because you noticed and taught her as being exceptional. The bottom line is, yes, there is rule for an exception to the rule. But other than that, it proves the rule in the sense that it endorses the rule. The rule is that overall, women should not be learning Torah. And as of now, we didn't see any exceptions other than this very unique demographic. Things changed in a significant way, or at least began to change in a significant way, when we come to the story of Chassidei Ashkenaz. The Chassidei Ashkenaz, they didn't call themselves Chassidei Ashkenaz, they called themselves Chassidim. This is a group that existed in Germany and the Rhineland around the late 1100s and the 1200s, the 1300s. And this is a group, the Sefer Chassidim, that we're familiar with, and Savas Rabbi Yehuda Chassid comes from this. The Rekeach, Rabbi Elazar Rekeach, was one of the Rabbanim within this movement. And it's a fascinating movement in terms of they're very particular about specific things. And they care about specific things. They promote certain things. more than the average of Yahadus Ashkenaz at the time. And it's against that backdrop that we're going to start seeing a change. Now, before I show you that, let me just point to a text from, there's a professor in Israel, Ephraim Orbach, and he wrote a sefer, a 2-volume book on the Tosus called Balei HaTosus. And in his first volume, on page 18, he quotes from a non-Jewish source, a student from a famous Catholic theologian. The Catholic theologian's name was Peter Abelard. And Abelard he died in the year 1142, and he had a student who's writing later in the 1100s, early 1200s, he's writing. What does the student write? The student is basically preaching to a Christian audience in this book. And he writes, we Christians, we have a big problem with our educational system. Because parents, when they want to educate to be a good Christian, they do it, what he writes is for the wrong reasons. They take one son, and they send that one son to learn theology and to learn the religion and all that. And why? And the rest not. And only one son. Why? The idea is because in those days it was a good business to be involved in the clergy. And another plus is you didn't get married. At least not officially. So there's no children, there's no heirs. So you have someone who's well connected, who's part of the elite, and he's going to gain wealth. And when he dies, that goes to the family. So it's a good idea to always have, it's like just a good investment to put one person of your family, put him into the monastery. And he writes that that's doing it for the wrong reason. And then he says, and this is very interesting, he says, but the Jews, look at the Jews, right? And he says, the Jews, they have it different. If a Jew has, he writes, 10 children, he'll send all of them to learn, not for any benefit, but just because they want to understand the Torah of their Torah, God's Torah. And then he says, and not just the boys, but also the girls. This is the text from the student of Peter Abelard that is quoted by Ephraim Orbach in Balei HaTosus, again, written sometimes in the late 1100s, early 1200s. Now we need to ask ourselves, you have a text here, you have someone saying that the girls are getting an education, but everything that we saw before didn't lead us to that result. And it doesn't sound like this is an exception. It sounds like there's some sort of norm about education that's here. Now, obviously, if you're trying to give your congregation a hard time, maybe you play up what's going on by the other people in a way that you're saying a little more than the reality is. But still, if he's preaching to his people, and they're all like, what are you talking about? Our Jewish neighbors, none of them are educating your daughters. So some of this has to stick. And so as a result of this, people look at this and say, there had to have been something here about education of girls that could have been in reference. And that's where the Sefer Chassidim comes in. Because I'm going to show you that a Sefer Chassidim polemicizes about the need to have education for girls, which tells us, number one, it was controversial. Some people didn't like it. But number two, it also tells us that some of them, and there were communities who were doing this. So let's read this passage in the Sefer Chassidim. He says as follows, Chayev Adam lelame levnoisav ha-mitzvahs kamoin piskei halachas. A person is obligated to teach his daughter the mitzvahs, the piskei dinim. The Gemara says, Misha malamed lebitay Torah ki'ilu malamda tiflos, that if you teach Torah, it's like you're teaching tiflos, and I'm not sure which interpretation of tiflos he's going with. Don't worry about that. Zeu oimek Talmud, that's learning deep Talmud. V'tama mitzvahs, that's learning, investigating the purpose of the mitzvahs. V'soidei Torah, the secrets of the Torah, Kabbalah, and the like. That aim, malamdin, not leisha, not lekatan, women and children, not. Avol hilchas mitzvahs, the dinim, yelamed lo, you got to teach her. Im loy tei the hilchas Shabbos, if she doesn't know the halachas of Shabbos, heyach tichshma Shabbos. How's she going to keep Shabbos? V'chein kol mitzvah kadei lasais lizar b'mitzvahs, you got to teach them the mitzvahs so that they know how to do it. Now, where's my evidence? He's making a reasonable argument, but at the end of the day, where's your Talmudic evidence that this is something that you need to do? So he quotes two things. Number one, he quotes a Gemara in Sanhedrin. The Gemara in Sanhedrin says that during the times of Chizkiah Melech, they made a census in the land of Israel, and they saw that everyone was baki in dinim of Tumah and Tara. He quotes it as Taras and Kachim. And the language of the Gemara there is men and women, boys and girls. Everyone was baki in the nuances of Tumah and Tara. No. What do you see from here? Says the Sefer Chassidim, presumably authored by Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. You see here that there's education. Otherwise, how do they have this knowledge during the time of Chizkiah? Then he points to another text, the story of Hakel. We're in Shnas Hakel now. So it's good that we're talking about Hakel. And in Hakel, what do you have? Noshim, and Taf. Came to hear what? Words of Torah. And much of what they heard was about the mitzvah. Sefer Dvarim is full of guidance of mitzvahs that you have there in Hakel. So here you see, again, a second proof. Then he goes off on a side note, and he says, however, now you're going to say, so I need to hire a teacher for my girl, so I'm going to hire a bacher. He says, no. You can't bring a bacher to lamed lebanos, even if the father is in the home. Now remember, the education that's going to happen here, the girls aren't going to school. It's in the home. So the idea is the father is working in the home, he has an office, he's like, okay, I'm going to hire a bacher, and the next room over, he's going to teach the girls. So Rabbi Yehuda Chassid says, this is not okay, because even if you're not going to have the problem of yichud, you're going to have the problem of hirhurim, and it's not tzniistic, and kol bi'isha erva, the voice of the woman is erva. I don't know if he means dafka because of singing the learning, or maybe he thinks even outside of singing, it's a problem. But anyway, so he doesn't want the idea of a bacher. So who should teach? In another source, in Sefer Chassidim, he says the father himself should do it. The father alone should do this teaching. Now he goes weiter and says, I'll bring you another piece of evidence that this is something that should be done. And he goes to the story of Isha Shunamis. And the Isha Shunamis is very clear from the story that every Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh she would go to the Navi. Why is she going to the Navi? She's going to the Navi, he says, because those were designated times for her to learn Torah. Turn the page. Then he says, Aval ba'omek, he comes back to what you shouldn't do. Ba'omek ha'alachu lepilpul, depth and pilpul, no obligation. Or mitzvahs that they don't have to do, also no obligation. But he comes and says, the mitzvahs that they need to do, they need to learn it. And then he says language. Language, I don't care. You want to learn in Hebrew, learn in Hebrew. You want to learn in German, Yiddish, whatever you want is fine. Then he says, men have to learn in Lashon HaKodesh. But women, any language. Then he brings one last source. The pasuk before Matan Torah, Kosemer Leveis Yaakov, the Saga Leveis Yisrael, Chazal tell us, Beis Yaakov is women. And Chazal also say Soimer is Lashon Raka. Yeah, why is it Lashon Raka? Because you're not doing deep, complex pulpulim. So Kosemer Leveis Yaakov, straight up, the Torah that's more straightforward. The Saged Levnei Yisrael, that's more Dvarim Kashim. Saged is Dvarim Kashim, that's more of the pulpulim. In another passage in Sefer Chassidim, he looks at the first few psukim in Dvarim. Because the opening pasuk in Dvarim says, the laws Asher Diber Moshe El Kol Yisrael, that Moshe spoke to all Jews. Two psukim later it says, Daber Moshe El Bnei Yisrael, he spoke to Bnei Yisrael, sounds like only the males. So he makes a difference. He says, when it was all Jews, that's Dvarim Hamu Kobalim L'Kol, things that everyone could accept. Kigoin, Agada, Umedrish, the Talmud B'loi Kushis Dvarim. Very interesting. He's not talking about halacha here, but he's assuming that even women, are listening to Agada, Agadata, Midrashim, the Talmud that doesn't have Kushas, Dvarim, Shemevinim Kulam, these types of things everyone's doing. Dvarim Chamorim, more like Kal V'chomer and Gzeira Shava, and going through the Midrash Atar and the Drashas Bam, that's only for the men. The bottom line result is we see between these passages of the Sefer Chassidim that he wanted that a father should teach his daughter, and it seems like there are two things that are going on. One is the halacha, and he's bringing proof after proof after proof. If everyone was doing this, and everyone agreed, he wouldn't be bringing these proofs. The reason he's bringing these proofs is because people disagreed with him. Now you may ask, how can you disagree? Everyone understands that to be a frumah Jew, you need to have this information. We'll return to that in a second. But clearly people were disagreeing what he was saying about halacha. But we also see in this text, it wasn't limited to halacha, because he seems to be talking about agada and medrash, which presumably is, these aren't difficult things, they help, they're warm, it's inspiring, it's nice, there's many important lessons you learn for life. So maybe you wouldn't call it halacha per se, but you would call it more musar that guides a person. And so therefore, the Sefer Chassidim is saying that this should happen. And it ends up in the Shulchan Aruch. This innovation ends up in the Shulchan Aruch. How so? Because the Ramah quotes it not from the Sefer Chassidim, but he quotes it from other sources that are all coming from this period in time. The Lashon of the Ramah in Yeridei Reish Mem Vav is Umakomakayim Chayaves Ha'isha Lilmoid Dinim Hashayachim Leisha. And then the Alter Rebbe, when it comes to the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe elaborates on this din and follows it. And by the way, this is true for a lot of Sefer Chassidim. It was once a time that you had the group of these Chasidei Ashkenaz, they were like a standalone entity within Ashkenaz. What eventually happened is they ceased to be a standalone entity, and much of their Mesorah and Minhagim filtered into standard Ashkenazi Jewry. Not everything, a lot, and that kind of became the result with the Ramah codifying it and the Alter Rebbe bringing it as a result as well. Let's read what the Alter Rebbe says inside in Hilchos Talmud Torah. After saying women should not learn Torah, because he passes like the Rambam, nonetheless, Leidais, and to know it. And he gives examples. Dine nida, tefillah, immersion, melicha, salting meat, isur yichud, the prohibition of seclusion, male and female, and all the mitzvahs haseh that ein azman grama, that aren't time-bound mitzvahs that women are obligated in doing, and chol mitzvahs lois haseh shal Torah, every single lois haseh shal divrei seifrim. All of these things the women need to learn. Now the Alter Rebbe adds an interesting line. And he says that in the olden days, Uvimayam used to have the Chacham used to doirish Hilchas Hamitzuyas Uregilos Usrichas L'chal Adam Leida'isam. He used to have that the rabbi would give a communal speech about practical halacha in a language that even the women and even the people who are ignoramuses would understand. And this happened midei Shabbos b'Shabbatoi. The Sefer Hasidim spoke about that. The Sefer Hasidim spoke about the Isha Shanamas going to the Navi to learn. The Alter Rebbe seems to be using that and saying, you may have a question if the Sefer Hasidim is right, and if the Ramah is right, how come we don't find in the Gemara this din, this idea, this is an exception? Amar Rava, that when Rabbi Eliezer said, don't teach your daughter because of all the negative things, there's carve out a huge exception for Halachas HaTzrichos. And by the way, it's not a small thing. Halachas HaTzrichos, the way the Alter Rebbe makes it sound, is a huge area of Jewish law. Why is there no mention in the period of the Go'inim of this? Why is there no mention in the early period of the Rishonim? So the Alter Rebbe seems to be saying the reason is because they had it. Just they weren't learning it from a text. They would learn it. They go to the shul. They heard the rabbi would say, this week is X. And so therefore you need to know the following. And every week they talked a little about Hilchos Shabbos and other relevant things. And like this, the women learned the material. Now, the Alter Rebbe is saying that for whatever reason, the drashas aren't halacha l'maisa. The Alter Rebbe, when it came to the Shabbos HaGadol drasha, also mentions it, that it used to be halacha l'maisa. Now it's these big pilpulim that aren't halacha l'maisa. Okay, so now the Sefer Chassidim came and said that we need to introduce this reform. Now, I said before that it was controversial, and that's why the Sefer Chassidim had to fight for it. So I asked before, how could it be controversial? Everyone understands that the women need to have this knowledge to live as a frum yid. Now, if you say the rabbi is going to give a sermon, good, so the rabbi will give a sermon. But now we just established that wasn't happening either. So who could have a problem with the Rabbi Yehuda Chassid answer? Who said, well, we get the answer from the Maharil. The Maharil lived in the late 1300s, early 1400s, or I don't remember right now actually which century he lived in, either the late 1300s or the late 1400s in Ashkenaz, in Mainz. And the Maharil has a shaila. And in the shaila, someone asked him, how could you say it's tiflos, it's negative to teach women Torah? Don't they need to know halachas hatzrichos? Literally lifting the passage from Sefer Hasidim and saying, don't they need to learn it? And then he says, and we find Bruria and women like that. And then he quotes the Gemara that Sefer Hasidim had, that in the times of Chizkiah, the women were very knowledgeable about Tumah and Tara. So the Maharil answers, Tshuva, to teach women, yes, it's true, they need to do all this. Women should not be taught. Then he says an amazing line here. Even if it would be a mitzvah to teach women, I would invoke the principle of eis lasais here. What does this mean? There's this teaching in the Gemara that although the law may be one thing, sometimes the Chachamim have the koyach to say that it's better for Judaism if we suspend the law in this area because the ends justify the means. So he's saying that the ends, even if it were an obligation to teach women, we would suspend it because the end justifies the means. The yatzas charebev say anything you're going to gain, the loss is going to be a lot more. He does not elaborate on what it means, but I don't know if he has to, because we already have the Rambam from before, and we already have Rashi from before. So he basically is saying, if they're right, and I think what they're saying is right, it's just a terrible idea, even if they would be obligated. And so therefore, no, there shouldn't be any of this formal education. How much more so that they're not commanded? Here's $1 million question. What about the knowledge for the mitzvahs? They could learn it through just receiving the general principles from the environment. And when they have doubt, they'll ask a Rav. And look what he says here. We see it in our generation. That many of them are very well versed in the dinim of salting meat and of washing meat and nikur, removing the gidanasha, and the hilchis nida. And look what he says here. V'akol al pi hakabala mi bachutz. So what he means by Kabbalah is without books. That for him is the line he doesn't want crossed. Mi bachutz, on svarim. And then he says, and that's what happened by Chizkiah. The days of Chizkiah, yes, it did show Torah was so powerful and was so widely disseminated. The men learned Tumah and Tara so well, so they observed it, and then the women and girls picked it up, but they picked it up by osmosis, not by formal training. And this is what he says. And he says, and my evidence is, it says over there, also Tinik and Tinoikis. You think little girls learn Mamish every din in Tumah Tara? Can't mean that. So what does it mean? Osmosis. Good. So it means osmosis also for the older women. And this is his argument. This answers the question. The debate this was the debate. I know that the Maharil is living later than Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. So the debate was an ongoing debate. It was a debate during the time of Hasidei Ashkenaz, and it was a debate later in the period of the Maharil, the end of the Tkufa of the Rishonim. And what was the debate? The debate was, women need to observe halacha. What's the best way to get that done? Without having a rabbi teach them. So now you understand the Chiddush of the Sefer Chassidim. The Chiddush of the Sefer Chassidim was that there should be some sort of formal education where the father sits the girls down and goes through material in a book. Doesn't matter what language, but presumably there's a Sefer, there's a book, something like that. The Maharil believed that it's possible to have all the frumkeit that you want without having any of that, and you could see it's an interesting debate. Now, historically, which one happened more? Maharil implies that in his day, he's writing that in his day, most of the women are not having the formal education. So we know, Sefer HaChinuch, the Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid is saying this should be done. We know sometimes it was done, I'm assuming it was done. Look, the non-Jews thinks that the Jews were doing it, so presumably it was happening. But at the end of the day, for most centuries, the majority, this was not happening. It was more the Maharil's model was what was happening, and not the Sefer Chasidim's model. In other words, if you went, even in the times of the Alter Rebbe, and even in the very villages where the Alter Rebbe was living, and you would make an investigation to see, were the girls being formally educated and learning halachas hatzrichas? I'm not saying, were they learning mamash halachas hatzrichas the way the Alter Rebbe laid it out? My hunch is that the answer is no. The Aruch HaShulchan says this, and he brings the Ramah. He brings the Ramah. You need to learn halachas hatzrichas. Look what the Aruch HaShulchan says. However, me oilam loy nahagnu lalamdo mitoich hasefer. Never happened. We never learned from a book. V'loy shamanu aminik. It goes down from mother to daughter, and that's all that it is. Now it happens as follows. Came along the beginning of the 20th century, and the movement that girls need to have schools. Once girls need to have schools, and Gedolei Yisrael signed on to the idea that girls need to have schools, so obviously there needs to be a curriculum. What's going to be in the curriculum? That's when some poskim fell back on this idea, which although it wasn't being used for many years, all of a sudden you had sources to rely on. What do you have to rely on? You had, first of all, Sefer Hasidim quoted the Hakel. Hakel was reading Torah Shabbat. So clearly, we should have Torah Shabbat in the curriculum. Then there's halachas hatzrichas, so we should bring Kitzur Shulchan Aruch into the curriculum. That's halachas hatzrichas. And then the Sefer Chassidim also spoke about Agada and Medrash, right? I know he mentioned Talmud B'loi Kushas Dvarim, but I'm going to ignore that for now. He mentioned Agada and Medrash, and so let's have some Medrash and Agada and Musar in the school curriculum. And that pretty much was the beginning of what the rabbis endorsed as the Judaic curriculum in schools like Beis Yaakov. Okay, and there are differences of opinion amongst Fruma Poskim about how wide that should be, how narrow that should be, but that's where I want to go now, is start looking at the sources, how the Rebbe addressed this very topic. So, when they put out the Sefer HaMinhagim, Rabbi Groner and Rabbi Greenglass in Montreal worked together on producing the Sefer HaMinhagim, and the Rebbe was heavily involved in the process of putting out this work. And at a certain point, they had included this basic idea that women should learn halachas hatzriches, and the Rebbe, in his holy handwriting, added the following paragraph. Sefer HaMinhagim, page 84. Kivoin, asher memitzvos Hashem, shechiyuvan tmidi, lo yifsak ma'ala adam afilu rega b'chol yamav. There is a concept of a constant obligation, where not even one moment of the day we don't have this obligation, and it's both for men and women. What is it? Achtos Hashem, Avas Hashem, and Yiras Hashem. And then the Rebbe points out that because of Yeridas Hadoros, that our generation is not as high as previous generations in terms of our stature, therefore, tzrichin liyagia rabba v'atzuma kful muchbelas, we need to work really, 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 really hard, To have the proper meditation, v'asaga adrush, and the proper understanding in these things of Achdas Hashem, which lead to Yira and Ava. So in other words, maybe once upon a time it was very easy to have Achdas Hashem. Maybe once upon a time it was very easy to have Yira and Avas Hashem. Today it's very, very hard. And how do we obtain that? How do you get that? Women have to learn the portion in Torah that's going to bring Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem. And women are obligated to learn that part in Torah that discusses Achdas Hashem. How the whole concept of Achdas Hashem, which is basically the Rebbe saying, the halachas hatzrichos model includes learning Pnimiyas HaTorah, includes learning Chassidus. And here I'm going to show a pattern where the Rebbe basically, working within halachas hatzrichos, expanded the boundaries of what halachas hatzrichos are. And here in this text that the Rebbe wrote in his own handwriting, establishing, and then the Rebbe referred to this many, many times, that learning Chassidus is part of halachas hatzrichos. Let's recall, what did Sefer Hasidim say? That one of those things women shouldn't learn is Sisrei Torah, Rimzeh, the secrets of the Torah. And here the Rebbe is saying, Sefer Chasidim's very model, which is halachas hatzrichos, demands of us that we teach Chassidus. So there are two thoughts that I have about that. Number one, you see the Rebbe talking about Yeridus Hadaris. Maybe then Ataka wasn't a need. Today there is a need. Number one. Number two, there's another important thing here. This gets into a much larger conversation about, is there a difference between Kabbalah and Chassidus? On a very simple level, Kabbalah and Chassidus are not trying to do the same thing. Chassidus' goal, and we started learning Shar Yichud V'Emunah, you're able to see. Shar Yichud V'Emunah is supposed to be the first volume of Tanya. So in a sense, you could say this is like the opening of what Chassidus is about. And what does Shar Yichud V'Emunah says? You need to have Avas Hashem, you need to have Yiras Hashem, and for that you need to have Achdas Hashem, so therefore I'm producing this text on Shar Yichud V'Emunah. And so that's what Chassidus is geared for. Chassidus is geared for Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem that comes through a proper understanding of Achdas Hashem. But Stam Kabbalah, including the Kabbalah that the Hasidei Ashkenaz were involved in, was about learning the secrets of the Torah, and not necessarily was it geared and tailored toward this goal. And so therefore, it's not, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid could say no to Kabbalah, but the answer could be yes to Chassidus nonetheless. This is all Chassidus. But then, there are at least 4 letters of the Rebbe where the issue of learning Gemara comes up. Now, the issue of learning Gemara, it should be off the table, where everything that we've been learning about. Rabbi Yehuda Chassid said, not Gemara, not Oimek, not Kal V'chomer, not Gzeira Shava. Every page of Gemara has this type of material. Till now, we left some room where we say, oh, that's not allowed, that's Tiflos. That's what Rabbi Eliezer said no to, and the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch all endorsed it. And so you have these 2 lanes. You have the Tiflos lane, that's a no-no. You have Halachas Hatzrichos, that's okay. And presumably, before we read these letters, you'd assume that Gemara falls into the category of the no-no. So let's look at the first letter, Igus Kodesh Chelek Yud Ches, a letter from Tav Shin Yud Tes on page Tav Samachet. And what does the Rebbe say? In response to your question, you're talking about an idea of learning Gemara in a mixed class of boys and girls. So the Rebbe says, really, there are 2 questions here. One is, should we be teaching Gemara to women? 2 is it okay to have mixed classes? So the Rebbe, the issue of mixed classes is not for today. So the B'mayna l'she'ela ha'alef, about the first question, B'chlal, as a general rule, yesh lizor b'chegoinda, you need to be careful, shaloi lifroids gather anog b'mokay, not to break out of the norms and the boundaries in a specific place. In other words, what the Rebbe is saying is, if you live in a community that has a norm that women don't learn Gemara, and you're going to start learning Gemara, that's inappropriate. We're very sensitive to the idea of communal norms and not breaking communal norms. And that's the first point that Rebbe says. But if there isn't a minig in the place where you're living, so then the Rebbe says, you shall follow the din of the Alter Rebbe, Shulchan Aruch, and Hilchas Talmud Torah about halacha. That what? Shagam noshin chayova is lilmoid. Women are obligated to learn halacha, namely the halacha that's relevant to them, and therefore the Rebbe says, "V'livchar b'mesechta, choose a meseches sheshamu vayis halachas hamuris, choose a tractate that discusses the relevant halachas." Well, did we just read that correctly? The Rebbe is saying that if there isn't a norm in the community that you're breaking, choose a mesechta of Gemara that is relevant, and based on what? Based on the psak of halachas hatzrichos. So in other words, now what does halachas hatzrichos mean? That not only learn Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, but learn the background of those very halachas. That's what it sounds like here. Okay, but there's only one letter. Now let's go to another letter. This is from way later in Tafshan Lamed. Igos Kodesh Chelech Havav. B'mayna lemichtava mechaf aleph iyar b'shayelas benegea limud Gemara l'naidus. You're asking a question about teaching Gemara to girls. So again, the Rebbe does the same thing. Here is the lashon of the Alter Rebbe in Hilchos Talmud Torah, and he quotes the whole lashon. B'hesam l'psak halacha anal. In accordance with that ruling, hariyesh l'nairos limud gadol she'efshar b'Gemara. Girls have a huge area of learning that is possible in Gemara. Again, based on the Alter Rebbe. The Rebbe is expanding the boundaries of what halachas hatzriches are, that as long as it's talking about something that's relevant to women's lives, so then that's part of the psak of the Alter Rebbe, which is an amazing thing. Then the Rebbe adds, be'ikr, it's Shulchan Aruch and Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. By the way, even Shulchan Aruch, there are poskim who would not bring a Shulchan Aruch into a girls' school. Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, yes, but learning in the Shulchan Aruch, or the Mechaber and the Ramah and that type of stuff, no. But the Rebbe here says, Gemara, Shulchan Aruch, and Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, of course, Limud Hamevi Lidei Maisa. There are two other letters of the Rebbe on this subject, and one of them the Rebbe writes. Someone saying he's learning Gemara, so the Rebbe writes, "Imrak bekalu, if it's easy, if you get this done, you should organize it in a way that you're learning the sugyas that are shayches le'inyanim shel poil." And I heard from Rabbi Groner when I was in Australia. He told me that his father started a shiur for women in Gemara, and the Rebbe said it should be sugyas that are relevant to the woman's life. So here we see two major steps that the Rebbe took here. One, saying Chassidus is part of halachas hatzrichos, and number two, saying that Gemara, depending on the Masechta, also is part of halachas hatzrichos. Here's another situation where the Rebbe did this. The Frierdiker Rebbe spoke a lot and wrote a lot about the ancestry of the Alter Rebbe. And the Frierdiker Rebbe wrote about a rabbi by the name of Baruch Baklan, and his son-in-law Reb Moshe. And he writes about them, and this is printed in Sefer HaMamor in Tafshin Tes, page 43. He writes that Lam doing an Abanis Torah, they taught Torah to the women. And he writes that Reb Baruch learned with his daughter Rachel. This Rachel married Reb Moshe. This was a secret, in other words, because it was controversial. Then he says as follows, Rachel had a daughter whose name was Dvair Leah. Dvair Leah was the sister of Reb Baruch, and Reb Baruch is the father of the Alter Rebbe. So the Alter Rebbe's aunt, Dvair Leah, was a Lamdonis. The Alter Rebbe said, Azi is given a Lamdin. And the Frierdiker Rebbe adds, then in those days, saying someone was a Lamdin meant something. And says, Lamda Rambam and Gemara. Okay, now the question is, how are we supposed to understand this? How is this mutter? Learning Rambam, Gemara, she's a Lamdin. What's going on over here? So the Rebbe wrote a footnote to the Sikha of the Frierdiker Rebbe. And what does the Rebbe do? The Rebbe says, see the Shulchan Aruch Yeridea, see the Sefer Chasidim, see Hilchos Talmud Torah, and quotes the Alter Rebbe on Hilchos Talmud Torah that says, halachas hatzrichas you need to do. In other words, what's the justification for this Rachel and this Dvair Leah to have learned this Gemara, ad kadei kach to become a Lamdin, and a real Lamdin, and to learn Rambam, and to learn Gemara? Halachas hatzrichas. It's halachas hatzrichas. So we have four letters of the Rebbe, and we have this, all of a sudden, really making a case. The Rebbe is saying something here about how he understands halachas hatzrichos, at least today. All of this came to a head, I guess you can say, when the Rebbe had a meeting, a Yechidus, with the Belzer Rebbe, Dalet Adar Sheni, Tafshin Mem Aleph. And the Rebbe was speaking to him about the need to learn Chassidus in the schools, the boys' schools, and the girls' schools. So he said that Chassidus is deep stuff, and his understanding, his Masorah is that while there are some elements of Torah that should be learned, anything that's depth, that is in the lane, that's tiflos, that's in the lane, that's not allowed. And I guess here I should point out that once you have women learning Maseches Brachos and Maseches Shabbos and all those sugyas, so then you have to ask yourself, and what's wrong with learning then Zvachim? Like, you're going to become sophisticated through Zvachim in a way that you didn't, in a way that's going to lead to cunningness and shrewdness that's negative? Like, it's a fair question to ask on the Shitta of the Rebbe. Like, why would you then draw the line? Or what now is prohibited? Once you reach this space where you say, Chassidus, all good. Gemara, anything halachas hatzrichos is good, so then, like what? Not. Okay, we'll return to that in a second. So the Belzer Rebbe is having this discussion, and the Rebbe says, and he says, I'm against Hamaka. You can't go deep. That's a clear line. Because you go deep, then you run into the problems that we're speaking about. Either Rambam, they're not going to understand it, so you're wasting your time. Or Rashi, you're developing a character, they're going to weaponize it in a negative way. So the Rebbe said, no, you need to have depth. Today, people want depth. If you're not going to give men or women depth, they're not going to appreciate what you're saying. It's not going to go anywhere, and it needs to. The Rebbe brought numerous cases to demonstrate the point. So the Belzer Rebbe asked a very good question. He says, if you follow your logic, you should be learning Mishnayos and Gemara, which the Belzer Rebbe was not doing in his Moistus. So he asked the Rebbe. By the way, all this you could hear on tape. According to the Rebbe, should we be teaching girls Mishnayos and Gemara? So the Rebbe said, Mishnayos is not a shayla. Mishnayos is just halachis. So the Rebbe said, I don't see an issue with learning Mishnayos. You're just learning halacha. And presumably, assuming, if you want to say that the Rebbe means here Mishnayos on areas that are relevant to a woman's life, then what's the shayla? By the way, this is a Shul of Moshe Feinstein, where he says, absolutely not. Now I'll teach Mishnayos. Moshe Feinstein, he asserted learning Mishnayos. The Rebbe said, doesn't see an issue learning Mishnayos. But in Gemara, the Rebbe said as follows: when they asked me, it's interesting lashon. When they asked me, I answered that they should teach the Gemaras that are connected to halachas hatzrichis, like for example Shabbos and brachas. In other, the Rebbe is saying, I never gave ha'ira. I never publicized what should be done. But when I'm asked about this, this is what I've been said. So now we have like 5 examples of the Rebbe basically using this idea of halachas hatzrichos includes the Gemara. So then the Belzer Rebbe asked the great question. So then what's malamda tiflus? What is prohibited in your model? And here's what the Rebbe responded. The Rebbe responded, my point has been that today tiflus is out there. Using the idea of using your head to do negative behavior for men and for women, for everyone. That's already kind of the default because of the environment that we live in. So no, you can't say that teaching Torah is going to lead to someone doing an Aveda. No. We live in a society in where we're so exposed and overexposed to so many different influences. That is the negativity within us. And that's what we're up against. And that's what we need to battle. And how do you battle that? You battle that with having expanded Torah learning. So in other words, the Belzer Rebbe asks, where is the tiflus? And the Rebbe seems to be saying, there isn't. There isn't a lane that is off limits. That's at least the implication that happens over here. There's an interesting hemshech to this, in where the conversation then turns to whether the girls in the Belzer Moistus are overexposed, because the Belzer Rebbe feels that they're not. So he's saying, what do you mean? Like our girls, we're going to protect them, and we're going to shield them, and we're going to make sure they don't see and learn things that are going to put any negative influence within them, and then I feel like we're good. And the Rebbe seemed to be saying that if you're doing that, then you're essentially minimizing your reach. In other words, the Rebbe was saying you should have breita harchavis, and I think you have breita hasagis, and that should mean reaching more people and more families, and that would inevitably include some of those people who you're excluding on what you're saying right now. Fascinating discussion. But anyway, all of this is till Shabbos Parshas Emor Tavshinun. Shabbos Parshas Emor Tavshinun, you have an amazing sikha from the Rebbe. The Rebbe was magia this specific sikha. And the major idea in this sikha is that it's a great idea for women to have a lot of learning of Torah. L'chol harosh, the Rebbe says, first of all, hanashim chayava is lilmaid halachas hatzriches lem. They need to learn the relevant halachas, which the Rebbe says is a ribui gadol halachas haTorah. It's an abundance of halacha. V'halavai, if only kol hanashim were biki and b'chol zeh, if only all the men were baki in this. Okay, we know that already. V'oid v'ikar, more important, limud pnimius haTorah, learning Chassidus, v'yesh l'hoisef b'zeh gam b'negei la'halacha learning Chassidus. Okay, so far we didn't learn anything new. Halachas hatzriches and Chassidus. Then the Rebbe says as follows: v'yesh l'hoisef b'zeh, we should add gam b'negei la'halacha she'ein tzrichos lahen. Also, things that are irrelevant, they should be learning. That's new ground right now. We never had that before. V'chol inyanei haTorah, all inyanim of the Torah. Okay, now I'll be honest with you. Some people they get a little uncomfortable with this. You know, if because the Rebbe seems to be breaking down boundaries over here. Okay, so the Rebbe asked the question himself. The Chachamim said not to teach the Torah. So the Rebbe here makes 3 points to make the case of why we don't need to be concerned about that. Point number 1, the Rebbe alludes to the idea that we spoke about earlier, that throughout Jewish history there were always women who excelled in Torah learning. In other words, this din was never absolute. From day one, it was never absolute. Because we had the daughter of Reb Shmuel in Baghdad, we had Bruria, and we had throughout history women, so there was always exceptions. Once you say there's always exceptions, then we could be open to expanding what the exception will look like. If one person could be an exception, can you perhaps say a generation could be an exception? So that's the first point that the Rebbe points out, is the fact that there were exceptions in the past. V'oid v'ikr, then the next point that Rebbe makes is that we see that a major leap has been made in recent generations. What's the major leap? The fact that women don't stay home, girls don't stay home, but they go to Moshes Chinuch. At the time when this started, when the Beis Yaakov started, this was controversial and this was new and people were saying, how you talking? But most of the major poskim said this is a great thing to do. So that's also a precedent where we see already there was a major change in women's education, and it was a change, and the Befedish was a change, and nonetheless, it happened already. So now if you have data point 1, and you have data point 2, and now we're going to add a third piece. What's the third piece that we're going to add? The lashon of the Rebbe is Shabalav Hachi, 2 lines on the bottom in the right-hand column. Shabalav Hachi, Loimdois Hanoshim V'Habonois Limudim Shoinim Shal Yodam Nichnas Behem Ar Mumis. The same point that he made with the Belzer Rebbe. That with you or without you, the women are very much exposed to different types of learning, and I don't think he necessarily is limiting this to academic learning. I think it's general exposure. And therefore, that armumis, whatever you want to define that as, that information that gets into your head and shapes your identity and leads you to do something negative, that's already there. And so therefore, what was the purpose of this din, lechatchila? Why the Rabbi Eliezer said no? He wanted to guard what? Yirah Shamayim and frumkeit. If that's your motive, you got to flip it around today. If that's your motive, not only it's permitted to teach Torah Sheba'al Peh, and remember, in this section he's talking about Torah Sheba'al Peh beyond what's relevant. Mesedim is that moreover, al pi tam halacha zu atzma, if you follow the spirit of the law of Rabbi Eliezer's law, tzarich lalandam Torah Sheba'al Peh, loy rak limud halachos psukas b'li tameh, not only dry law, elagam limud taimei halachos, also the background and the reasons of the halachos. Remember, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid himself said not to learn the taimei halachos. Va'ad l'shakla v'tarya shebetorah, shakla v'tarya, the back and forth. Back and forth. What does that sound like? Without saying it, what does that sound like? Sounds like he's saying the word Gemara, but he didn't say the word. I'll grant you he didn't say the word. But shakla, what's the goal? Shemetava adam, because by the nature, a man or a woman is you derive more pleasure when you learn the reasons. You derive more pleasure when you get involved in the discussion and in the debate. And then what do you gain from that? When you go through that process, then your mind, your brain, your identity is developed in line with the Torah. So in other words, what the Rebbe is saying is like this. If you live in an age in where you're feeding your mind with all different types of ideas, whether they're academic ideas in a school setting or in a college setting, or even on the street, listening to the radio, reading magazines, or just talking to friends, or reading social media, all that goes somewhere. Nothing doesn't go. All that goes somewhere, and all that shapes identity, and all that shapes character. And that has consequences. And living in that type of society, in that world today, that's what we're up against, and that's what we need to battle against. So how do you do that? You don't just do that by saying, well, I'll learn another hour of Torah with you. I'll learn 2 more hours of Torah with you. No, what you need to do is you need to hook in the mind. You need to hook in the very identity of the students. And how do you do that? When all of a sudden their brains are struggling in a concept of Torah. They're getting involved, they're enjoying it, they're meditating upon it, they're thinking about it. It draws them in, they're dreaming about it. All of a sudden now, what's shaping their mind, rather than the Reader's Digest, what's shaping their mind is the shtickle of learning, whichever learning it is. And that's what we need today. So what was this based on? This was based on 3 points. One point is, I said before, there's already an exception. That makes it easier for us. The fact that there was always an exception means you go one exception, we can make bigger exceptions. Number 2, rabbis already made a huge leap in this area by opening schools. So, and now there's this need that the Rebbe is saying, put that together, you have this bundle, women should be learning even areas in Torah that are beyond the halachos hatzrichos. Now, then we come to the next part of the Sikha, we're wrapping it up. 3 more minutes. The Rebbe says as follows. Interestingly, it turns out that we live in a generation now when there's a safa and limud Torah for women. Why is this happening on a more deeper metaphysical reason? So the Rebbe says, we're getting closer to the era of Mashiach. And as we get closer, one of the markings of the era of Mashiach is tarba adei v'achachma, widespread knowledge. So therefore it makes so much sense that as you get closer to that, there's going to be more knowledge. And so therefore it makes so much sense that there's a major isafa and limud haTorah that's going on today in our world. Why dafka with women? Why is isafa dafka with women? So the Rebbe adds in a footnote, v'yesh loymar, that the reason is dafka with women because al pi Kabbalah, the era of Mashiach is an era of eshes chaya la teres baila, that the woman is like a crown above the husband's head. And what does this mean? Without getting into the depth of the Chassidus, is that there is the level that represent the woman on the spiritual level, which in Zman HaGolos is lower than the level that represents the man, will be flipped. And in Mashiach's time, it's going to be a crown above the head. So therefore, because the Messianic era is a feminine era, so therefore the Isafa and Limud HaTorah, it makes sense that it happens dafka through women. Okay. So now like this. I want to wrap up this with the following. The Rebbe, we know, had the campaign of Rambam. And the Rebbe would talk about the 3 promenades of Fabrengen. The Rebbe would talk a vart on that day's Rambam. This included the kinnus of the women. The women would have a kinnus every year before Shavuos, and the Rebbe would speak about, very often, spoke about the day's Rambam. Which shir? The 3 prakim, the shir of 3 prakim. So on the Sicha, it's Muga Chaf Ha'ir, Tav Shemam Zayin. The Rebbe said as follows. The primary shir of Rambam for women is to be in the track of Sefer HaMitzvahs. Why? It's very interesting. The Rebbe didn't speak about intelligence. The Rebbe didn't speak about capacity in terms of mental capacity or anything like that. The Rebbe said that because women are busy with chinuch habanim v'habanis at home, most of their time is dedicated to that, so therefore they have a smaller shir in Rambam. That is the only reason they have a smaller shir. Then the Rebbe said the following. Aval afal pikein, muvam v'gam poshet, shekal achas menishei Yisrael, every single Jew, chafetza o mishtadedlas, wants and is trying, taking the necessary steps, lahagia l'shleimus naili yisyaser b'limud Rambam, to go up, to grow, meaning to go from Sefer HaMitzvahs to Parak Echad, ad l'shir achi gadol, until the maximum of Gimel Prakim Layon. So here you see that even 3 Prakim, the Rebbe thinks that women should have that as a goal, as an aspiration, as something that they are looking for. So I'll conclude like this. We saw an amazing journey over here, because you started with a Gemara, where once we paskin like, yes, there is the voice of Ben Azai there, but once you paskin like Rabbi Eliezer, which is what happens in the Rambam, and the Mechaber, and the Shulchan Aruch, and the Torah, it's like the door is shut. There is nothing other than the exceptions of the amazing women, the 1 in 1,000 or the 1 in 5,000 who excelled. But other than that, the door was shut. And then what we found was the innovation of the Sefer Hasidim, where this idea of learning formally halachas hatzrichos was introduced. It was applied, but wasn't really so applied until we come to the Beis Yaakov era, when it's applied pretty broadly, and that is, I think, standard today, how it is applied broadly. But it could be applied in a very narrow way. We're learning Kitzur Shulchan Aruch for the specific things that the women need. And in some places, that's where it is. But then, I showed you that with the Rebbe, we saw a more maximalist understanding of this din. Putting Chassidus into it, and putting Gemara into it as long as it's relevant. And then on top of that, in this Sikh and Tav Shenun, saying there needs to be something beyond that, and on top of that, as we just explained and elaborated at great length. So Mechanchim, and rightfully so, have a discussion and a debate, and I think there's differences of opinion. What does this mean practically for a girl's curriculum today, in this community and in other communities? And let's remember, the Rebbe spoke about Minhag HaMakom. The Rebbe spoke before about you have to be sensitive to what local norms are. So that's another factor that needs to be taken into consideration when dealing with this. And so there is a disagreement on this issue. How much? Where? Should it include Gemara? Should it be for everyone? Should it be for some? And this is fine. It's a valid discussion and debate that the Machan can have, and I don't have any public views on that specific matter. But what I do have public views on is that what everyone could agree is the goals and the language that the Rebbe did speak about over here. And I'm going to add, it's not only relevant for women, it's also relevant for men. The Rebbe spoke about over here this idea that there needs to be a tainug in limud Torah. You need to have that. A Jew today, if they didn't have an experience in their education where they had a tainug and limud Torah, if they didn't have an experience in education where it was a real intellectual experience, which is clear words in the Sikha, then we're not living up to what our mandate is. So the mandate has to be that there's depth, there's sophistication, there's gishmak, so much so that it shapes identity. And the question for us as parents, and the question for us as mechanchim, is are we achieving that goal, and are we doing everything in our power to be able to achieve that goal? Or as the Rebbe said, that our chushim and our kishrenis, the basic elements of our emotions and our mental identity, should be in line with Torah and guided in that way. And that's also relevant for men. And that should be an inspiration for us to take a little more time to learn Torah, because that's one of the goals of learning Torah, is that it shapes our mind. And circling back to the woman of the Saita we started with, let's remember what Chazal say. Ein adam ivar aveira elen kein nichnas boi ruach shtus. The aveira occurs because of the ruach shtus that lands in a person's mind. So everyone needs to create for themselves, male and female, something that's going to battle against that ruach shtus. And we see here the Rebbe saying that a key element of that is a deep, sophisticated, comprehensive way of learning Torah in a geshmaka way. Okay.